One day in a small diner, a brother and sister, Joseph and Sydney, meet. Some time ago, they pulled off a robbery together, netting them $7 million, which the man has brought with him in a large bag. They briefly discuss their plan of action for the near future. Sydney needs the money to pay off debts and provide for her daughter, Steph. She wants to right her wrongs because she regrets not being there for her daughter as she should have been. But first and foremost, the pair needs to hide in such a way that they can't be found. Joseph mentions he knows just the place, but at that moment, a police siren blares outside the window and they both run off. In the woods, they change clothes, throwing their old ones into a swamp. Joseph says that a friend of his has allowed them to hide out in her country house, a place long forgotten by everyone. Soon they reach a cornfield, and as they make their way through it, they hear gunshots. They approach the house cautiously. To their surprise, there is a car parked in front, and three guys are amusing themselves by shooting empty bottles with rifles. Sydney calls out to the troublemakers, but her shotgun doesn't scare them. However, when Joseph appears on the other side, the trio takes off. The brother suggests they hurry. They go inside the house, which appears to be empty. Joseph immediately notices a large clock. Then the siblings walk through the house, noting the mess and overall neglect. At that moment, they once again hear police sirens. Sydney suggests running, but Joseph points at a door leading to a pantry and announces it's exactly what they've been looking for. He then rushes to the clock on the first floor and starts turning its hands in a particular sequence. Sydney does the same with other clocks, and when they all start chiming, the pair steps into the pantry and closes the door behind them. Thunder rumbles and lightning flashes above the house. Just then, Joseph opens a small notebook and orders his sister to dial a certain number on the antique telephone inside the room, and to hang up right after she says the required words. Outside, they can hear the voices of police officers searching for them. Sydney dials the number and utters a few words, then immediately hangs up. Darkness and silence descend. Sometime later, Joseph opens the door and they step outside. There is no one around. The house is neat and cozy. Everything is in its place, and the clocks have stopped again. Following instructions, Joseph winds the clock in the living room. Sydney can't believe they actually pulled it off, and now they are safe. But Joseph reminds her they must stay there for at least 14 days, which doesn't seem too hard. The fridge is full of food and drinks, and there's a pile of discs on a table to help them pass the time. On the first day, they simply rest. Joseph goes for walks and inspects the grounds, while Sydney takes a bath and tries on old dresses she finds in the closet. On the second day, they cook dinner and spend time chatting on the porch. During the day, they count their loot, planning how and where they'll spend it. Sydney misses her daughter and looks at her photo, but consoles herself that soon all this will be over and they'll be able to live without needing anything. They examine the portraits hanging in the house and practice shooting, at which they both seem to be quite skilled as they have rifles with scopes. Thus, 13 days go by. One evening, Sydney explains to her brother the value of certain items stored in this strange house. For example, a bullhook is not cheap, but modern people simply don't know what it's for. Suddenly, she switches to talking about their relationship as brother and sister. The man feels he never gave her enough love and now suffers because of it. But Sydney herself thinks her life hasn't turned out too badly. She does have a daughter, after all. Even so, her brother promises to do everything he can to make it up to her. Sydney then asks about his female friend who provided them with such a magical hideout. But Joseph can't explain who she is or how her house works. He admits that the woman only gave him her notebook out of pity. Suddenly, Sydney remembers their parents. She remembers their mother. Joseph remembers their father. Together, they recall how their mother used to play the piano. But Sydney's strongest memory is of the song she hears on a stereo system disc. Though she doesn't know its title, she hums the old tune and then suddenly asks Joseph to take her back to her daughter. Finally, the time comes when they can return home. Sydney tidies up while Joseph packs their bags and burns the remaining trash. But when they approach the pantry door, they find it boarded up. On a plank, words are carved directing them to an old mill nearby. Sydney has a breakdown and runs toward the mill. Her brother catches up and manages to calm her down. They begin examining the place and discover church pews in the basement. Soon, their flashlight beam hits a decomposing body. Carved on a stand is a warning that they are stuck in a time loop, along with an invitation to sign beneath the message if they understand and are willing to comply. Sydney refuses to do this and flees. She's desperate to escape the house, but not far off in the field, she suddenly feels ill. She vomits blood and realizes she cannot leave the perimeter that's holding them. Her brother pulls her back to safety. Sydney comes around, but cannot believe what's happening. She falls into despair and cries, remembering her daughter. Her brother explains that the body at the mill is the very acquaintance who allowed him to hide out there. He recognized her by the clock that had been a family heirloom. The pair wonders if anyone could possibly find them here, but they covered their tracks so well that there is no hope of rescue. Joseph has no choice but to sign the warning, after which a safe appears before them in an instant. Recalling the notebook, he opens it using the numbers written there. Inside is a tape recorder and a note saying he must say something and then close the door to establish a connection. Joseph does as instructed, and a minute later, when he plays back the recorder, he hears a stranger's voice. The stranger says they aren't supposed to be on the farm. He knows about the money, and Sydney offers to give him a share so they can leave. But the recorder goes silent. Joseph believes they're talking to someone in the future. Sydney repeats her brother's steps, opening and closing the safe. The voice comes back, saying it intends to erase all trace of their existence to protect the delicate balance of this place's powers. But Joseph realizes the strangers must want something from them, or else they would have destroyed them a long time ago. The stranger explains that the only way for them to get out alive is to remain on the farm and kill a mysterious visitor who will arrive at some unknown point in the future. They must destroy his remains, and then these unknown people will help them return to their own time. Joseph and Sydney go back into the house. Sydney checks the closets and fridge. Once again, they are fully stocked with food and alcohol. She plans to stay in such a way that she can constantly monitor every approach to the house so they won't miss the visitor's arrival. Sydney is convinced that if they're stuck here, they are already finished, but she's still willing to try to break out. Joseph suggests setting up a watch schedule and taking shifts while Sydney pours out the alcohol. They stash the weapons they have around various hiding spots in the yard and in the mill. While Joseph stands guard, Sydney methodically searches the house, studying old portraits and photographs on the walls. Then they switch places, with Sydney surveying the grounds. Almost a year goes by. The brother and sister have every convenience. The refrigerator reliably provides them with food, they can keep themselves clean, and they live in comfort. Sydney continues examining old newspapers, magazines, and documents she finds in the house. She watches vintage broadcasts and practices using the bullhook, and in the evenings she builds campfires. One day she tells her brother she found a box of photographs at the mill, which helped her discover that the images in the foyer aren't of the farm's original owners. The history of this land, relocated here by unknown forces, covers events up until the Korean War of 1955. After that, there's nothing. No proof anyone lived here afterward. The naval officer in one of the pictures apparently died here around that same time, supposedly from falling down the stairs. She believes this was approximately when those who seized the place with their technology first arrived. They made the house their own, installing electricity, heating, and even television. For some reason, they used this downtime, and when the siblings entered, they got stuck, but that still doesn't answer their questions. Joseph becomes irritated, trying to make Sydney believe it's all his fault. He's even willing to blame their parents. He thinks the people responsible don't care about them at all. They're doing this simply because they can. No one ever shows up here uninvited, so they'll never get home. That leaves them only to die a slow death. A quarrel flares up between the brother and sister because Joseph is convinced that Sydney doesn't believe him and thinks he's ready to abandon her there, but he soon pulls himself together and they reconcile. They head downstairs to the foyer. While Sydney watches TV, Joseph looks at the identical tattoos they both share, reminding them they're family. Their waiting drags on. Joseph tries to contact the strangers again, but the tape recorder remains silent. He begs for any kind of sign as he's exhausted by the uncertainty, but the tape is blank. One day, a mysterious visitor appears on the farm. He watches Sydney through binoculars, then walks toward the house and prepares to shoot her. But Joseph spots him and shouts to warn his sister. The bullet misses its mark. The hooded stranger then opens fire on Joseph, but he also manages to duck back into the house and hide. They begin hunting the visitor, but can't find him yet. Joseph circles around the house and tries to reach a stash of weapons hidden in the field. The stranger fires at him. Joseph heads back into the house where the hooded man catches up with him. Later, Sydney hears music from the field and sees someone with a tape player from which their mother's song is playing. Joseph lies at his feet. Sydney goes out into the field. An argument ensues and Sydney is wounded. She takes cover in the house, bandages herself, and discovers the closet is blocked once more. In a rage, she tries to break down the door, but a warning appears on the board, telling her not to do that. At the same moment, a safe appears in the room. Meanwhile, Joseph, his legs bound, regains consciousness in a church. Sydney reopens the safe connection, insisting on leaving with her brother. The strangers warn that if she breaks down the door, both will die. At that moment, the visitor notices Joseph trying to reach his pistol and strikes him. A stranger says they can't risk the visitor escaping. Sydney mentions her mother's music, but they insist the visitor is not her mother. Meanwhile, the visitor, who for some reason cannot speak, writes a note instructing Joseph to contact these strangers and assure them he and Sydney have fulfilled the requirement and killed the intruder. Sydney is in the midst of being persuaded to disclose everything she knows about the visitor, after which they promise they will explain why they're so sure it isn't her mother. Then the connection abruptly cuts off. In the church, the visitor makes Joseph confirm the intruder's death on the tape recorder. Joseph says the body is outside, that he's injured, and if the strangers can contact Sydney, the two of them will present the body. Sydney receives this information and sets out to rescue him. Meanwhile, the visitor, communicating in writing, tells Joseph that he's looking for the person who killed his family. Just then, Sydney makes some noise outside and the visitor rushes out. A shootout begins, and this time the visitor flees. Joseph manages to grab his pistol and free himself, while Sydney chases the stranger into the house. They fight, and Sydney wounds him, knocking him down, and tries to reveal his face. Struggling, she finally manages to pull off his mask and recognizes her now adult daughter, Steph. While she's trying to make sense of this, Joseph bursts in and shoots the visitor. Sydney tries to shield Steph, and the bullet hits her instead. While the brother mourns his dying sister, Steph escapes through the pantry, is left alone. Joseph tells the stranger on the tape recorder that the visitor is gone. He buries Sydney and, following instructions, waits at the mill. He's transported to an unknown location and meets the stranger from the tape recorder plus a woman. They demand information about the visitor, but Joseph knows nothing. They say he and Sydney broke the rules and will be erased, apologizing for having hoped for a better outcome. Joseph begs for one last chance. The strangers agree and send him back to the first day. At the cafe, he reveals to Sydney he has lived through this cycle many times. Unable to prevent her accidental death, he tells her the only way to stop it is to kill him on the spot, take the money, and return to her daughter. Sydney shoots Joseph and flees as police sirens approach. It's a strange and even absurd film because the viewer is left expecting an explanation or a resolution to this bizarre paradox, but it never comes. Who is behind all of this? What they hope to achieve and why the heroine's daughter turned out to be the one she had to kill all remain unanswered mysteries.